In the closing years of the 17th century, a barefoot and starving Spanish friar named Andrés de Avendano staggered through the dense jungles of Central America. His skin torn by thorns and his feet shredded by shards of flint hidden in the swampy ground. He and his companions had just failed in their attempt to persuade the Maya king of Teazal, the last independent stronghold of a once mighty civilization, to bow to the Spanish crown and accept Christianity. And now, exhausted and half-mad with hunger, they were fleeing back towards Spanish territory through hill after hill of unbroken forest, when suddenly they crested a ridge and froze at the sight before them. A colossal stone pyramid erupting from the green canopy, wrapped in centuries of roots and vines, its plastered chambers and vaulted corridors telling of a lost city far grander than anything he had seen among the simpler Maya communities of the Yucatan coast. And though he could not have known it at the time, Avendano had become one of the first Europeans to lay eyes on the ruins of Tikal. Once the beating heart of a Maya empire that had commanded the region for 7 centuries, before collapsing into silence more than 500 years before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. That collapse, sudden, total, and still not fully explained, is the great mystery this script sets out to explore, tracing how a sophisticated civilization built without metal tools, without wheels, and without a single beast of burden managed to raise cities that rivaled the ancient capitals of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and asking what forces of environment, politics, and human failure conspired to bring it all crashing down. Although Avendano had stumbled across Tikal by accident, the wider world would not learn of the lost Maya cities until more than a century later, when the American writer John Lloyd Stevens and the British artist Frederick Catherwood pushed deep into the Guatemalan interior in the 1830s, enduring clouds of mosquitoes and endless mud to reach a city buried beneath the trees, climbing broken staircases, half swallowed by roots to find stone monuments toppled and strangled by vines. The silence broken only by the calls of howler monkeys, and when Stevens published his account, illustrated with Catherwood's astonishingly precise lithographs, it caused a sensation, because the prevailing wisdom of the time refused to believe that indigenous Americans could have built such things unaided, with scholars inventing elaborate theories crediting Egyptians, Phoenicians, wandering Israelites, or even the mythical lost civilization of Atlantis, until Stevens firmly insisted, based on the carvings and artistry he had personally examined, that these ruins were the unaided achievement of the people who still lived in the region and called themselves the Maya. What both these adventurers had found was not simply an abandoned city, but the physical remnant of a genuine historical catastrophe, the wholesale collapse of an entire civilization. And to understand how thoroughly that story had been buried, it helps to look at the fate of Maya writing itself, because the Maya were a fully literate people who recorded history, astronomy, mathematics, and poetry in bark paper books using reed pens dipped in ink made from conch shells, developing the only complete writing system ever created in the Americas. Yet almost all of that literary inheritance was deliberately destroyed following the Spanish conquest, largely due to the actions of a zealous 16th-century bishop named Diego de Landa, who arrived in the Yucatan as a young missionary, meticulously documented Maya language and customs in order to better suppress them, and eventually launched a brutal inquisition against the indigenous population, torturing suspected practitioners of the old religion and, in one infamous episode, gathering together a huge collection of ancient Maya books and burning them in a public bonfire, an act he later described without remorse as necessary, because the texts contained nothing but superstition, leaving only a handful of Maya books known to survive anywhere in the world today. And yet history carries a bitter irony here, because the very notes de Landa compiled while trying to erase Maya culture, including his rough attempt at recording a Maya alphabet, later became an essential tool that helped modern scholars begin decoding the hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into stone stelae, painted pottery, and plastered walls across the old Maya world, inscriptions that have since transformed our understanding of who these people actually were. Contrary to popular imagination, the Maya were never a single unified empire, but rather a shifting constellation of independent city-states and kingdoms spread across what is now Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico, sharing a common language family, religious worldview, and artistic style while constantly competing, allying, and warring with one another in a political landscape, not unlike Renaissance Italy or classical Greece. Ruled by kings and queens who gave themselves vivid names drawn from nature, adorned themselves with jade ear ornaments and tattoos of green ink, and built their identity around a religion of cyclical time in which the future could be divined by studying the patterns of the past, worshipping gods of sun, rain, maize, and the shadowy underworld believed to lie beneath caves and the deep natural sinkholes called cenotes. And while popular films have painted the Maya as obsessed with human sacrifice, that image owes much to Spanish colonial propaganda used to justify conquest, and the archaeological evidence suggests ritual killing was a real but limited and occasional practice, dwarfed in brutality by the violence the conquistadors themselves would later inflict. What made Maya civilization especially remarkable was the sheer difficulty of the environment in which it arose. Because the Yucatan Peninsula sits atop porous limestone bedrock that swallows rainwater almost as soon as it falls, leaving the region almost entirely without rivers and forcing communities to rely on natural sinkholes and hand-dug, plastered reservoirs to store water through the dry season, while the soil itself was thin, quick to erode, and unable to sustain intensive farming without long fallow periods, meaning Maya farmers depended on slash-and-burn agriculture that could feed only a handful of extra mouths per farmer, a stark contrast to modern industrial agriculture. And unlike almost every other early civilization in world history, the Maya had no domesticated draft animals at all, no horses, oxen, or even llamas, meaning every stone block used in their pyramids, every sack of grain, and every trade good had to be carried entirely on human backs, and every one of their soaring limestone temples was cut and shaped using nothing but obsidian blades. Since Maya society never adopted iron tools and only slowly acquired limited copper work late in its history. Despite all of this, Maya civilization flourished for millennia, with roots stretching back to around 1800 BCE when early communities first domesticated maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, and the cacao bean that would become a prized ceremonial drink. And by the early centuries of the first millennium CE, the central lowlands were home to dozens of powerful city-states, the greatest of which for a long stretch of the classic period was Tikal, whose stone temples rose an astonishing 60 meters above the jungle floor, crowned with sculpted masks of the jaguar sun god and painted a vivid red, a city so visually striking that filmmaker George Lucas would later use its ruins as the backdrop for a rebel base in the original Star Wars film. And at its height, Tikal may have supported a population approaching 90,000 people within its urban core. Tikal's fortunes, however, were deeply entangled with a much more distant and even larger metropolis far to the northwest, the great city of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, a cosmopolitan hub of well over 100,000 residents that controlled crucial trade networks and held a monopoly on a particularly fine variety of green obsidian. And sometime in the 4th century CE, Teotihuacan's influence reached deep into the Maya lowlands, apparently helping install a new ruler in Tikal known to history as Curl Nose, whose tomb was later found filled with artifacts of that telltale green obsidian, and stone carvings from the period even depict a shared temple built jointly in both Mexican and Maya architectural styles, suggesting some form of alliance, embassy, or outright political domination that historians still debate. Bolstered by this powerful foreign patron, Tikal expanded aggressively, subjugating smaller neighboring kingdoms who began referring to Tikal's rulers using a title meaning, his lord, a clear marker in the inscriptions of vassal status. And for a time it seemed Tikal might dominate the entire Maya world, if not for the rise of its great rival, the city of Calakmul, whose kings called themselves the Lords of the Snake, and who pursued Tikal's downfall not through open confrontation, but through generations of patient diplomacy, slowly stitching together a web of alliances among the smaller kingdoms surrounding Tikal, choking off its trade routes and encircling it in what amounted to an ancient Cold War, a strategy that finally began paying off in the 6th century, as Teotihuacan itself declined and collapsed under mysterious circumstances of its own, stripping Tikal of its powerful ally right as tensions with Calakmul's growing coalition peaked, and matters worsened under a Tikal king remembered as Double Bird, whose poor political judgment triggered the loss of the loyal client city of Karakal, and following a small-scale raid against it, provoked Karakal into declaring what Maya inscriptions call a star war, a rare and total war of conquest rather than the usual limited, ceremonial raiding common to Maya warfare. And in 562 CE, that alliance of enemies, quietly assembled over decades by Calakmul, finally overwhelmed Tikal itself, storming the city, smashing its temples, toppling and defacing its royal monuments, and plunging it into more than a century of stagnation during which no new stone monuments were carved, and its defeated king vanished from the historical record, presumably executed by his captors. This long rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul would ebb and flow for generations, but the eventual collapse of the wider Maya world cannot be blamed on warfare alone, and to understand what truly happened, historians have turned to one of the most striking pieces of evidence available: the dated stone monuments the Maya carved to commemorate major events, because tracking the frequency of these inscriptions across the centuries reveals a civilization at the height of its confidence and productivity right up until it wasn't, with the city of Kapan, for example, producing only about 10 dated monuments a year around 514 CE, climbing to 20 a year a century later, and reaching more than 40 a year by 750 CE at what appeared to be the peak of prosperity, only for that number to collapse to roughly 10 by 800 and to 0 by 900, a pattern repeated with eerie consistency across the whole Maya lowlands as one city after another simply stopped producing new inscriptions. This wave of silence beginning in the southwest along the Usumacinta River, where Bonampak fell quiet in 792 and Yaxchilan in 808, spreading outward as Calakmul went silent after 810, Kapan after 822, and Tikal itself, which had briefly regained its old glory in the mid-8th century with a fresh burst of monumental construction, finally falling silent in 889. With the very last dated Maya inscription anywhere appearing at the remote city of Tanana in 909. And what makes this pattern so unsettling is that none of these final inscriptions hint at any awareness of catastrophe. No warnings, no laments, no decline in artistic quality, just an abrupt and total cessation, as though the lights of an entire civilization were switched off city by city without anyone realizing the darkness was permanent. Modern archaeology, environmental science, and skeletal analysis have gradually assembled a picture of interlocking pressures rather than a single cause, beginning with the basic arithmetic of feeding an increasingly enormous population using an agricultural system with very little margin for error, since unlike a modern industrial farmer capable of feeding well over 100 other people, a Maya farmer using traditional slash-and-burn methods and low-protein staple crops could support perhaps 5 others beyond his own household, and by the 8th century Tikal's urban population alone may have swollen past 90,000 people crammed into densities exceeding 800 people per square kilometer, forcing ever greater demands onto an already strained countryside. Compounding this was severe and sustained deforestation, since pollen samples pulled from lakebeds and swamps across the region show that by the end of the Classic period, The once thick lowland forests had been almost entirely cleared, not just to make way for farmland, but to fuel the enormous limestone burning operations needed to produce the lime plaster that coated every Maya temple, palace, and public plaza, an industrial process that consumed timber at a staggering rate. And as the protective tree cover vanished, farmers were left with no choice but to work the same exhausted plots of land again and again, without the long fallow periods the thin tropical soil desperately needed to regenerate. A short-term survival strategy that guaranteed long-term ecological disaster. Layered on top of these human-driven pressures came a climatic catastrophe largely beyond Maya control, as sediment cores from lake beds across the Yucatan reveal that around 760 CE, the region experienced its most severe drought in roughly 7,000 years. A megadrought scientists now link to a documented dip in solar radiation recorded in Greenland ice cores. A shift that pushed Atlantic trade wind patterns northward and starved the Maya lowlands of the rainfall its entire water infrastructure had been built around. And this convergence of overpopulation, deforestation, soil exhaustion, and drought struck at the very foundation of Maya political legitimacy. Because Maya kingship rested on an unspoken bargain in which rulers claimed divine responsibility for ensuring good harvests, favorable rains, and the general goodwill of the gods. A bargain preserved in surviving post-conquest texts like the Chilam-Balam, which describe rulers being called upon almost ritually to guarantee sustenance for their people, meaning that when the rains failed and the crops withered, ordinary Maya farmers had every religious and political reason to conclude that their kings had failed them and no longer deserved their loyalty. Nowhere is this process documented in more granular detail than at the city of Capan in what is now western Honduras, a smaller but densely populated Maya center famous for its ball court and its close alliance with Tikal, which thrived through the 5th and 6th centuries on the fertile alluvial soil of its narrow river valley, its population climbing toward 30,000 people by 800 CE, even as available farmland in the valley bottom ran out, forcing residents to build increasingly precarious homes climbing up the surrounding hillsides, settlements that lasted barely a century before being abandoned, their floors now buried under a telltale layer of eroded soil that reveals exactly what went wrong, because pollen evidence shows the pine forest once covering those hills had been steadily cut away. And once their root systems no longer anchored the fragile slopes, seasonal rains stripped the hillsides bare and washed acidic, nutrient-poor sediment down into the valley floor, degrading the very farmland the whole city depended on, and skeletal remains recovered from Capan burials dating after roughly 650 CE show a clear rise in signs of malnutrition and chronic illness, porous and weakened bone structure, and dental stress lines, afflicting nobles as well as commoners, though far more severely among the poor, until finally, in 822 CE, Capan's last known king began carving a traditional royal monument to mark his accession, only for the carving to be abandoned halfway through, one side finished, one half started, two sides left permanently blank, as if the sculptor simply put down his tools mid-task and walked away. And within 30 years, in 850 CE, Capan's royal palace was burned to the ground, marking the definitive end of its ruling dynasty, though the city itself did not empty out immediately. Since roughly 15,000 people, about half its peak population, were still recorded living in the valley a century later in 950 CE, before the population continued its slow decline, until the valley was fully abandoned by around the 12th century, and the forest quietly reclaimed it entirely. At Tikal, meanwhile, a similar unraveling can be traced through its monuments, since after a genuine mid-8th century resurgence in which the city reasserted dominance over its old rival Calakmul and launched an ambitious wave of temple construction, the following decades saw Tikal's subordinate allies begin erecting monuments proclaiming their own independent kingship rather than loyalty to the throne in Tikal, with smaller centers like Uaxactun, Ixtlu, and Jimbal all breaking away. until by 900 CE Tikal's royal line had vanished entirely along with most of its population, though archaeological evidence shows the abandoned royal palaces were not left completely empty, since poorer residents from the city's outskirts appear to have moved into the deserted halls over the following century, leaving behind thick layers of discarded pottery and household debris, and even scratching informal graffiti into the once sacred plastered walls, images of temples, animals, and everyday figures, evidence that these later inhabitants still revered the old royal monuments enough to occasionally relocate them, though notably without the ability to read the very hieroglyphic inscriptions carved upon them, since several relocated stones were later found reinstalled upside down, a small but poignant detail suggesting an entire cultural memory had been severed even as ritual reverence for physical ruins lingered on. And crucially, unlike so many other collapsed civilizations throughout history, not a single one of these abandoned Maya cities was ever meaningfully reoccupied or rebuilt. The forests were simply allowed to swallow them whole, and it's believed that by the time the Spanish arrived at the end of the 15th century, the jungle canopy covering these ruins had only just fully regrown since the collapse centuries earlier. Taken together, this evidence paints a picture of cascading systemic failure rather than any single dramatic event, environmental degradation, and a historic drought colliding with an agricultural system already stretched to its limits by explosive population growth, undermining the religious and political legitimacy that held Maya kingship together. And as royal authority crumbled city by city, waves of displaced refugees would have fled toward neighboring kingdoms already struggling with their own food shortages, spreading instability like a contagion across the entire lowland region. And because the Maya world had never unified into a single empire capable of coordinating relief or reform, each individual city-state was left to fend for itself as competition over dwindling farmland and water tipped into open, often brutal conflict. A pattern reflected in the archaeological record at sites like Piedras Negras, where excavators have found clear evidence of buildings deliberately burned during this final period, and at Yaxchilan, where the city center was hastily fortified with defensive walls built by tearing stones from its own temples and palaces, littered with the broken remains of spears and javelin points that speak to violent, desperate last stands. And yet for all this devastation, the descendants of the Maya never disappeared, since millions of Maya people live across Central America today, carrying forward fragments of language, ritual, and belief passed down orally through generations even after Spanish colonization and religious persecution tried to erase them entirely. And archaeologists continue to uncover the true scale of what was lost. As recently as 2015, confirming that a feature in Tanana, long assumed to be a natural hill, was in fact one of the largest pyramids ever constructed in the Americas, a reminder that the buried cities of the classic Maya still have secrets left to reveal, and that behind every silent inscription and every collapsed temple lies the story of real people who once believed their gods, their kings, and their world would endure forever. Right up until the rain stopped coming and the forest quietly closed back over everything they had built.